Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community, and all who wish to join us online, science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Rebecca Vilkomerson. She was the Executive Director of Jewish Voice for Peace from 2009 to 2019. We'll be talking about the situation in Israel-Palestine. Rebecca continues to work as a consultant for a wide variety of groups working on Palestinian liberation, Jewish solidarity, and other domestic justice issues. She's been published in venues ranging from the Washington Post to Haaretz in Israel to Democracy Now! In 2017, she was named one of the 50 most influential Jewish leaders worldwide by the Jerusalem Post. From 2006 to 2009, she lived in Israel with her family. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I think that the place that I'd like to start this conversation is actually just if you could give us an overview of kind of the different parts of the Jewish community. Because one of the things that I think happens a lot when people start talking about Israel and the Israel-Palestinian conflict is that there's a sort of perception that there's one Jewish perspective on Israel, when in fact the Jewish community is quite diverse in terms of its approach to Israel and the politics that different segments of the Jewish community have in relationship to both Palestinian struggle and the state of Israel.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Well, the first thing I'd say is I'd want to separate out the Orthodox Jews, or more observant Jews, who in the United States, who, and there's several different communities within that community as well, which I'm less familiar with. I personally am part of the Reconstructionist movement. I was brought up in the conservative movement, and those are sort of different religious streams. And just to say, like, not all Jewish people are part of an observant religious community. There's a lot of people who are secular Jews, don't have much observance, but still very much identify as part of the Jewish community. So there's that as well. But we're going to put, I think, the Orthodox community to the side at the moment. There's some Hasidic groups, very also sometimes as the ultra-Orthodox, who consider themselves anti-Zionist. Generally, other Orthodox communities are extremely Zionist and tend to be very right-wing. While the other parts of the Jewish community, which are Reconstructionist, Reform, Conservative, or not affiliated with any of them, which is actually a huge proportion of the community, which tend to be, broadly speaking, Democratic, like something like very consistently, like 75% of Jewish people in the United States vote for the Democratic candidate for president. So you sort of get a sense of the overall orientation of the Jewish community. Now, on Israel-Palestine, there's a little bit more of a carve-out. So you have, like you said, a lot of diversity within the Jewish community. And I also want to emphasize that has shifted over time and is very dynamic over time. So if you actually look before 1967, most of the Reform Jewish community, which is the largest Jewish community in the United States, was actually anti-Zionist. And that was based in, 100 years of history from preceding 1967, when Zionism was actually very, very contested within the Jewish community. It was just one political stream of thought within Jewishness. So that has shifted, and now the Reform Jewish community is actually generally identifies as very Zionist. And in fact, and I think we'll probably get into this a little bit later, as you can tell, even in this conversation, I'm a little bit, maybe confusingly, mixing up religious identity and Zionist identity. And that's because in the United States, Zionism has become so identified with Jewish identity. And I think it's one of the things that actually needs decoupling. And so we can talk about that a little bit as we go along. But just to give you a sense of the breadth of the Jewish sort of peace movement in the United States, or the range of the left in Jewish American spaces, and where that falls politically. And again, you can have people from any religious stream in these political identifications. It doesn't always match, but there is some matchup. So that's why I started there. But I think you were interested specifically in sort of hearing about the sort of, I guess, generally pro-peace Jewish community, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the various organizations that are out there. The organization that I was affiliated with and still am affiliated with, I'm a very, very proud member of Jewish Voice for Peace, although I'm no longer the executive director. I think what distinguishes JVP from other Jewish organizations is that in 2019 we declared ourselves to be an anti-Zionist organization shortly before I left, and it wasn't for a related reason. I was very proud of that decision. But JVP has always been on the left wing of the Jewish community. And then there's organizations like If Not Now. If Not Now is a newer organization that came out after the Gaza war in 2014, and is very focused on the sort of younger generation of Jews. They self-identify as being of one particular generation. JVP, on the other hand, is a multi-general organization. And politically speaking, If Not Now defines itself as anti-occupation. I think they've started to move a little bit to the left. We're in another one of those dynamic political moments right now because of the assault on Gaza and the expulsions that are happening in Sheikh Jarrah and everything that happened in Israel-Palestine in April and May. We are in another reconfiguring moment, I would say, in both inside and outside the Jewish community in terms of people's politics on this. So in these last few months, I think If Not Now has started to use more language around apartheid and talking about Zionism, talking about the Nakba, which is when Palestinians were expelled from their homes and villages in 1948 and onward. But that's an evolution that they're going towards. Continuing to move a little bit more towards the center, the other big pole is J Street, which is more of a sort of democratic establishment organization, I would say. They call themselves a pro-Israel, pro-peace organization, so they are specifically aligning themselves to a certain extent with Israel while also trying to have a critical eye. So those are probably the three largest groups within the Jewish left. And there's other groups too. Truah, which is a group which grew out of Rabbis for Human Rights in Israel. The New Israel Fund, which focuses on funding and supporting organizations that support democracy inside of Israel. The Center for Jewish Nonviolence, which sponsors delegations that bring all of these groups together, doing on-the-ground solidarity. So as you can see, basically, as you were saying, Colin, there is a really wide variety, even within the Jewish left, in terms of political positioning and just sort of organizational culture.
So I think when we talked about the interview originally, we talked about maybe getting into some of the terminology a little bit later in the interview, but it occurs to me that you've just used two sort of terms that it might be helpful to sort of spell out a bit more for our viewers and listeners. And I want to bring a third term into sort of dialogue with them, which is you brought up anti-Zionism, you brought up anti-occupation, and then there's a sort of third term that gets thrown around a lot when people are critical of Israel, of anti-Semitism. And can you kind of, I don't think not everybody knows what Zionism means, for instance. And I think that for this conversation about Israel, I think it's very important to kind of provide a little background about Zionism as a political current within the Jewish community rather than, something that necessarily all Jews adhere to, right? And then to position that alongside anti-occupation and just how does it relate to this term anti-Semitism that gets thrown out a lot.
I actually cannot believe that I forgot to mention this. So before I go there, I should mention the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction movement. So the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanction movement is a call by Palestinian civil society to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel for its human rights violations. And that's another really big dividing line within the Jewish community. So Jewish Voice for Peace supports the BDS movement. If Not Now, doesn't have a position, but is leaning more and more towards it, I would say. And J Street opposes the BDS movement, but also does defend the right of people to engage in BDS. And then groups even more to the right of J Street really define BDS as anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. So that's why it felt important to bring BDS into the conversation before making the distinctions that you just brought up, Colin, so that folks could understand some of those dividing lines. But yeah, to answer your question, so anti-occupation, so the occupation is considered to be, when you talk about the occupation, you're talking generally about Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, and also the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights is in northern Israel and is a part of Syria that's occupied. East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza are areas that were conquered, Palestinian areas that were conquered by Israel in the 1967 war and have been occupied by Israel ever since. And that's where when you hear about settlements are being built in the occupied territories. So when people talk about being against the occupation, they're generally talking about ending, which is it's against international law for a governing power to permanently annex occupied territory, which is what Israel has been in the process of doing for decades, but has officially begun to do in those words in the last year. And so when you talk about being against the occupation, you're against Israel holding onto those lands. But generally speaking, the dividing line, again, is that you think that any territory that Israel had before 1967, Israel proper, shall we say, is I don't want to say beyond reproach necessarily, but is not necessarily worthy of criticism and is sovereign territory. I think the position that most Palestinians take and that anti-Zionists take is that the beginning of the issue dates back to the Nakba, which again I mentioned is when Israeli independence happened in 1948, which also included 750,000 Palestinians being expelled from their homes and permanently losing their land and property rights. And so that was part of the founding of the State of Israel. And when you're anti-Zionist, your overall perspective is that given that history and given that an enormous number of refugees were created during that process, that Palestinians actually by international law should have the right of return, and that you can't just criticize the time after 1967, but you have to also have a critique of what happened from 1948 on, and actually, even from before 1948, but that's getting into a little more history than we necessarily need to get into today. But the idea that there is a foundational issue, which you could, it's similar to what you could say in the United States, the fact that indigenous people were victims of genocide in the founding of the United States, that is an essential part of the story and tells you something about the definition of the state and the way that the state is run and the ethos of the state. And so starting from 1948 usually tends to go along with anti-Zionism, or sort of being on the path to anti-Zionism. Now, defining Zionism is another huge, complicated issue. I don't know if we can do all of that discussion completely because there's varying definitions, and in some ways, it's Zionism came out of the mid-1800s. It was a nationalist movement that began at the same time as a lot of other nationalist movements. It came out of the sort of European nationalist and unabashedly colonial movements. It was considered to be a colonial movement proudly at that time because that was very acceptable then. And like I said, it was actually very, very contested in the Jewish community. And it is important, as you mentioned, Colin, to emphasize that it's a political movement. It's not a religious movement. Although the way that it has evolved is that it's defined, Zionism refers to the land of Zion, which has a lot of religious connotations if you're an observant Jewish person, and the yearning for Jerusalem is part of the liturgy. And so there was some very, although the Zionist movement didn't originally necessarily, did say there needed to be a homeland for Jewish people, they didn't necessarily say it needed to be in the territory where it ended up. But because it did, there was a very, I would say, smart melding of these sort of religious and I would say generally metaphorical longings with the actual physical land. And so that's why it's often hard for people, including Jewish people, to detangle and decouple Jewishness from Zionism. But it is important to remember that Zionism is actually a political movement that's about land and property and rights and also from the Zionist perspective, self-determination, of course. And it evolved over a course of time when Jewish lives in Europe were extremely, extremely in danger. And then, of course, gained a lot of steam during and after the Holocaust when Jews were being exterminated, and the urge and urgent need for a safe haven obviously became much, much, much more urgent. So that was the background for the gradual adoption of Zionism among Jewish people. I'm obviously flattening out a lot of details here because of our limited time. Now, I think the thing that's interesting, like I said, one of the things I feel so proud about in terms of JVP is that we really reclaimed some of our ancestors' history and that history of anti-Zionism within Jewish thought by becoming an anti-Zionist organization. And the fact that in the United States, most people think that any person who is Jewish is automatically Zionist, and that if you're anti-Zionist, you must be anti-Semitic. has sort of become a truism, but it's actually not true at all. And again, I think the roots of that is because Zionism is about being a political entity. It's about a political reality, and Jewishness is a religion, and it's also a people. I think there is a general understanding that there is a bond among Jewish people around the world. However, that the fact that that does not give the right for Jewish people, for example, to have more rights in a state than other people do. And so I think that sort of, again, it's a little bit hard because Zionism was a pre-state movement, and once a state exists, whether you even need something like Zionism is another question. But the way it plays out now is that Zionism is seen as something that allows there to be Jewish supremacy inside of Israel, meaning that Jewish people have more rights than Palestinian people. And right now, inside of Israel, meaning inside the 1967 borders, 20%. It's important to keep in mind that 20% of the Israeli population is actually Palestinian. But there are an enormous number of laws that actually give more rights to Jewish people than to Palestinian people. And that's sort of in some ways, the essence of Zionism and the essence of the definition of Israel is that Jewish people have more rights than other people inside the state. And people who are anti-Zionist believe that that is not just, and that we can't support a state that gives unequal rights to different people based on their identity. And so I think that's at the core of it. Anti-Semitism is a completely different concept, which is about systematically discriminating against Jews or hating Jews. And you hate them because of their Jewish identity, you hate them because of their Jewish religion, and criticism of a state, any state, Israel, the United States, any state, I think is always not just okay, but is sort of something, a very important thing that needs to be defended. That no state, and this actions of a state can be considered to be beyond the pale because that gives a state carte blanche to do whatever it wants. While anti-Semitism, which are actions against Jewish people as Jewish people, is always wrong.
Right. I mean, I think that one of the things that is so complicated to try to understand the issue and the complexities of Jewish community, and that you've, I think, laid out just so helpfully for people, is that there's Jewish identity, which is an ethnicity or a collection of ethnicities and collection of cultures, right? Rather than just, it's not like a monolith. There's
right.
a shared heritage.
Right.
There's the Jewish religion, which again has great diversity within it, and then there's the political question of, which often gets polarized around Zionism, but functions elsewhere as well, as to how does one position oneself in relation to both Israel and the hierarchy of rights within Israel, right? Which is ethnically determined, which, there is a reason why some people have started referring to Israel as an apartheid state, because that's exactly what an apartheid state does, is structure rights so that you have different classes of citizenship.
Yeah, and it's more than some, to be honest, it's more than some people. You have Human Rights Watch, which is probably the preeminent human rights organization in the world, recently put out a report saying Israel's an apartheid state. And B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization in Israel, has done the same. And so, there's still a lot of pushback against that labeling, because obviously because of associations with South Africa, it is something that people are loath to accept if they are supporters of Israel and have grown up supporting Israel. But that being said, I think that the fact that people are trying to still make it controversial, I think there's overwhelming evidence that it is practicing apartheid.
Well, and I think that that's a very important point, and also I think points to just the ways in which it's often hard to have a conversation about Israel, because I think that many people don't want to have that label ascribed to it.
That's right.
Even though, from a technical perspective, even without making a moral judgment upon it, that would be a technical description of how it functions.
Yeah. Just to add one thing, Colin, if you don't mind, even I just did the same thing where I named Human Rights Watch and I named B'Tselem as an Israeli source. Palestinian human rights organizations have been saying that Israel is an apartheid state for decades, but they were never given the kind of legitimacy that Human Rights Watch and B'Tselem were given. And I think part of that also connects back to what we were just talking about anti-Semitism, because there's so much fear of being labeled anti-Semitic, so much of redefining of anti-Semitism that was a political process that right-wing Jewish organizations and the Israeli government actually colluded together to sort of redefine anti-Semitism to include being anti-Israel or being anti-Zionist. And there's a whole sort of theory behind that, which is like Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and so that makes Israel the Jew of the world, and so if you're against Israel, you're against the Jews. That's sort of the big philosophical grounding of that redefinition that happened over the last 2 decades. It's been enormously effective, and so therefore Palestinian voices are devalued, and people who speak out are very effectively often silenced, and with this anti-Semitism accusation. And so that's one of the reasons why, as you say, it's has often been such a hard conversation to have.
Well, and I think that one thing that we see within that, especially in your description of that, is actually just a reproduction within the discourse or the discussion or the conversation or the media, however we want to frame it, of exactly the dynamics of an apartheid culture, apartheid state, right? Like the voices of Palestinians are being discounted over and against voices from groups that, for whatever reason, are deemed as having more legitimacy by many people.
Right.
So I would be remiss, I think, if I left this conversation end without us, and we have a few more minutes, but and without talking a little bit about the complexities of the Israeli politics and Israeli Jewish community, because you just referenced, and we've been focused really on the Jewish community in the United States, or maybe we could expand that to say the Jewish community outside of Israel. But there's an enormous complexity within Israeli politics as well, much of which I think baffles people who are outside of Israel, and is that complexity is directly related to what just happened in terms of Netanyahu being deposed or voted out of office, however you want to frame it, as prime minister after 12 years. And that there's this coalition which actually has an incredible spectrum of political partners that are part of it, that are now backing a new prime minister and having gotten rid of, temporarily at least, Netanyahu. So could you talk about sort of the complexities of Israeli politics and, maybe some focus on the Israeli left, but also more broadly, like Ram, for instance, which are a Arab Israeli party, and and so forth.
Yeah. Well, I have to say I am not terribly impressed by the shifting government. And I'll explain why. The first things folks should know is that I lived in Israel for 3 years, from 2006 to 2009. My husband's Israeli, and so is my kids. So this is like a very personal, connection for me. It's not, and actually my aunt and uncle and cousins and grandparents are, my aunt and uncle and cousins are alive. My grandparents have since died, but my one big side of my family is Israeli, and then I also married into an Israeli family, so it's a very direct connection. And when I lived in Israel, I was very involved in I think what we all would understand as the Israeli left, which is essentially a non-Zionist or anti-Zionist left, and it's tiny. On the Jewish side, it's really, really tiny. It's an incredible, brave, committed, very hardworking group of probably no more than a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand people who are actively expressing solidarity with Palestinians, or actively working, putting their bodies on the line generally against the occupation, are doing really impressive work building solidarity with Palestinian communities. But they're very isolated. They don't have any political power in the electoral sense. And socially, they're often pretty ostracized. Like I participated in demonstrations myself during the first Gaza war in 2008, 2009, when I was living there. And, it was a terrifying experience. We were cordoned off, and people on the street would, throw eggs at us and try to physically attack us. So it's a pretty serious position to take that kind of leftist position in Israel, and not very many people do it. And of course, the political education that Jewish Israelis receive is very, very intense. And so it's very, very hard to resist. 20%, as I mentioned, of Israelis are Palestinians who have Israeli citizenship. and there's internal politics in that community as well that range from Hadash, which is a joint Palestinian-Jewish, originally communist. They still call themselves communists, but they're not, I don't think, actually communist. Party to all the way to the party that's now in the coalition, which is an Islamist party. And there's nationalist parties in between. So within the Palestinian sector, there's quite a number of parties. I'm not as familiar with those. Within the Jewish community, the reason I'm not so impressed by the end of Netanyahu's reign is that, I mean, the new government has no coherence. And it's true that there are some members of what are generally considered left parties in Israel that are part of the coalition. Any one of those parties, from the left to the right, could take this new coalition down. So I think it's an extremely unstable government. It's not going to last long at all. And I'm talking about months, not even years. And what really has united the Israeli public, the Jewish Israeli public, in the last couple of years has been getting rid of Netanyahu, full stop. And there are many, many, many people who cared only about that. There was no real political agenda beyond that. And so this is a real coalition of convenience that still gives the prime ministership to Naftali Bennett, who's actually in many ways to the right of Netanyahu. And I think one very uncomfortable truth about Israel right now, at least within the Jewish population, is that it's a very right-wing population, like over and over. There's been 4 elections in the last 2 years, and over and over again, the right just wins overwhelmingly. And there's variations of the parties within that right, and there's, ethnic identities or other kinds of, or religious identities, but the right is an overwhelming majority. And what is called the left or the center left, like Yair Lapid, who's supposed to be sharing the prime ministership with Naftali Bennett, he will be the next prime minister in a rotation agreement they've made if they make it that far. He's considered to be the center left, but he's still the right. So what you think of as the left, you're not talking about what we would think of as the left in the United States or in Europe. We're talking about something that's still certainly very Zionist, and also pretty neoliberal on the domestic front, and is not interested in ending the occupation, and is not interested in changing the status quo at all. So that's why I just feel like the change in government, although for people who care about Netanyahu being gone, and for anti-corruption reasons, I can understand why. It doesn't change anything fundamentally about the nature of the political system. I don't think there's a lot of hope to draw from it in terms of some new opportunities for governance. And so far, we haven't seen anything like that since the new government has taken power in the week or so since. And certainly, the history of the members of the government are very militaristic and quite conservative. And I think another thing just to mention is that one of the things about the Jewish Israeli public that's very different from the United States, whether Jewish or not Jewish, is that the younger generation in Israel is actually more right-wing than the older generation. So Israel does have a sort of socialist past, and has sort of become hyper-capitalist over time, and so the younger generation of Jewish Israelis is extremely right-wing. Well, of course, I think one of the most exciting things about what's happening in the United States right now is that the younger generation, again, these are huge generalizations, but the overall trend is that the younger generation in this country, whether on Israel-Palestine or on other issues, is actually way more to the left than older generations.
No, I mean, and I think that you see both those things if you look at those two different, the United States politics and Israel politics, right? I mean, like 20 years ago, or I guess maybe it's now 30 years ago, the prime minister of Israel was almost always part of the Labor Party, which was a party with roots in the socialist movement.
Yeah, and but the caveat to that, Colin, sorry to interrupt, is that the Labor Party is also where the settlements began. So I think there's often a sort of mythologizing of, so there is that socialist past, but there was part of that socialist past was also about Jewish labor over Arab labor in their parlance, and the settlement movement in the West Bank, which many people are against, here in the United States, it grew equally under both Labor governments and Likud governments. So again, that's just to reemphasize the fact of the sort of like general, more right-wing orientation of all of the Zionist parties in Israel.
Well, I think that's a super helpful point of clarification, and I think it just, it really underscores your point. But yes, and you see, in the United States, an expansion of, I mean, certainly amongst my friends, I mean, there are much more to the left of their parents' generation,
Yeah.
I mean, and yeah, there's a whole other conversation to be had about that, about millennials reviving organizations that their great grandparents belonged to,
Yeah.
right? I mean, which is a fascinating thing that I've actually personally been involved with, and whatever. But so I think that is probably a good segue to a conversation about the broader progressive agenda or left agenda and how it relates to struggle for Palestinian rights here in the United States. But as a way to get there, perhaps, or maybe not as a way to get there, but as a way station along the way, if not, I think that there needs to be, or it would be good to have a conversation about a question that I often get asked of, like, okay, why be critical of Israel, right? Because, like, Israel's a nation state, and, like, we can, like, think about lots of nation states doing awful things, right? So you could be like, we should be really focusing all of this energy that people focus on Palestinian rights, on solidarity with the Uyghurs, for instance, who are, I think, arguably undergoing a genocide in China, right? I mean, that's a thing that there is a lot of evidence for. A lot of organizations are arguing that, and why should we focus so much energy on being critical of Israel when we could be critical of these blatantly authoritarian states like, China, or, you pick your former Soviet satellite state, or, even, of course, what's going on in Russia. Why should we be critical of Israel?
Yeah. Well, I have a couple of different answers to that question. I mean, I think the first one is, I think there's often a sort of, I have to say, bad faith effort to sort of derail the conversation by saying, like, why are you so focused on Israel when there's so much other terrible things going on in the world? And the truth is there's always, like, many, many, many terrible things going on in the world, often under our very noses, and I think one of the things I like to mention is that when I first got politicized about the United States and the nature of the U.S. empire, I happened to be doing work in Guatemala, and I learned about the history of U.S. intervention in Guatemala. And because I'd spent time in Guatemala and I made friends in Guatemala, and it was the place where I first learned these things, I became very interested in the politics of Guatemala, particularly as it relates to the United States. I didn't really know very much at all about El Salvador, which is, another Central American country which has a very similar history. And it wasn't because I was discriminating against El Salvador in favor of Guatemala. It was just because that was the place that I happened to have experience and interest. And you kind of have to choose sometimes your battles because you can't fight on every single front or else you're ineffective. And so you choose places of focus. And so I think, just to address that sort of often bad faith argument about being like, why aren't you paying attention to this when you're paying attention to that? I think it's important. Like, there are many, many reasons various people choose to focus in various places for reasons of personal history and connection and relationships and all that sort of thing. Now, that being said, I do think people in the United States have a particular obligation to interrogate what's happening in Israel-Palestine, because the United States is the biggest, gives more money to Israel than any other country in the world by an enormous factor. And basically, the U.S.'s military, economic, and diplomatic at the UN, that sort of thing, by vetoing resolutions and that sort of thing, really the United States gives cover to Israel to continue its behavior the way it is. So in that sense, anyone who lives in the United States, I think, should have a particular interest in what is happening in Israel and to Palestinians. And then I think the third thing is, for those of us who are Jewish, we have many of us were raised to believe that we had a special relationship with Israel. And I think many of us have feelings of betrayal. I don't know how else to say it. And I think that's rooted also in the for me at least, I'll just speak for myself in this case, the concepts of justice, that the way that I was taught about justice, it was a very Jewish concept. And my understanding of my place in the world was as a person who was obligated to fight for justice because of my history as a Jewish person, because of my Jewish identity and my religion. And so therefore, to understand, when you come to an understanding that Israel is not what you've been told that it is, you often, that's a very emotional thing to find out, and it's a really can be a very intense journey for people. And I don't want to flatten the Jewish community. There are people who were raised by parents who were red diaper babies who were always anti-Zionist. There are people who had no connection. But I would say for the grand majority of Jewish people in this country, in these last few generations, Israel is seen as a place that is an enormous part of our identity. And so beginning to understand that that place that's an enormous part of our identity is not the moral actor that we've been taught it to be, I think is an extra incentive to speak out, an extra feeling of obligation to speak out.
I totally agree with, all of that. I think one thing I might, just observe about Israel for my friends who are further to the right of me, which is that, Israel, another reason why I think it's appropriate to be critical of Israel or focus such intention on being critical of Israel is that, it's supposed to be a liberal democracy. And by liberal here, I don't mean in the left-right spectrum, but in terms of the structure of governance and the governance, right? And the kind of broader political prediction of being a democracy. And within the global community, people like the current president of the United States claim that has a certain amount of respect for human rights and obligations towards human rights.
No, sorry to interrupt you, but I think that's part of the some of the, there's a phrase Israel is a democracy for the Jews and a Jewish state for everybody else, and so it's
right.
It's a democracy only for some people, actually, and everyone who's living under occupation has no vote and has had no vote now for, well over 50 years now. So even the conception of Israel as a democracy, I think, is something that we should probably reconsider.
Well, I think that's a very helpful point, and I think that actually, yes. I think that if it's in terms of criticizing Israel or why we might be critical of it, I think that really, strengthens the conversation. So,
yes.
We are almost out of time here, but I would love it if you could give us a couple minutes on how the broader left progressive agenda relates to the struggle for Palestinian rights in your view.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most exciting developments that's happened in the last few years, and it's sort of interesting because I think a lot of good things are happening here in the United States on the ground and on the political, electoral level in terms of this struggle, while at the same time conditions on the ground for Palestinians gets worse and worse. So that's sort of two truths we need to hold at the same time, I think, I look back to 2016 during the Democratic National Convention. JVP printed up T-shirts that said Palestinians should be free. I think on the front and on the back, it had a whole list of issues. It was Fight for 15, Medicare for all, climate justice, freedom for Palestinians, education for all. And those shirts I remember people were snatching them up like crazy. And so I think the idea was then, back in 2016, I think it was starting to become true, was that there was this understanding that if you were a person who had the values that you believe that everyone should have health care in this country, if you believe that immigrants should have full rights, if you believe Black Lives Matter, or if you believe people should be paid a living wage, then you also probably supported equal rights for Palestinians and all that entailed, and because it was based on the same values. And then what I think happened during the Trump administration, which is really interesting, is that there were more and more opportunities to help people see that Israel and the United States, under the Trump and Netanyahu governments, were actually doing some very similar practices. So, for example, in the Obama years, because the Democratic Party writ large and Democratic people writ large supported the Obama administration, and it was harder to criticize it, and the Obama administration was very pro-Israel, there was sort of a meeting of the minds there that was hard to push against. But in the Trump years, Democrats generally, and certainly liberal Democrats or people more to the left, but more in this case, I'm talking more about sort of mainstream Democrats, people who were very upset that Trump was separating families at the border. There was an opportunity then to talk to them about the fact that Israel actually is putting Palestinian children in jail. And, people who are upset about the Muslim ban in the United States, there was suddenly new opportunities to talk about the ban what effectively is, I guess you could call a Muslim ban into entering Israel, and people's rights to enter Israel based on ethnicity. So there are all these sort of the extremes of the Trump administration and the sort of like enmity that people felt towards Trump were in a funny way, I think, an opportunity to explain to people, and people were able to see a little bit more clearly the way some of those policies were in common. It became more clear that Israel's right-wing government had much more in common with our right-wing government than it did with any kind of left-wing attention. And that was also part of, a process that's been going on for a while, where there used to be a real bipartisan consensus in support of Israel among the party establishments, and now there's a real split. So the Democratic people identify as part of the Democratic Party are about half split, like against the occupation, Palestinian rights, that sort of thing, while the vast majority of Republicans support Israel. And a lot of that has to do with Christian evangelicals and their power and their money and their numbers and their strength within the Republican Party, which are a big part of holding up U.S. policy towards Israel. But it's no longer a bipartisan issue. Israel, more and more, at least within the Democratic Party, there's really a split between the old guard establishment and newer figures. And then, of course, we started seeing that in an official way in 2018 with the election of the Squad, and that has continued, and I would even say accelerated into 2020, where it's become more and more clear in a way that even 5 years ago it was sort of conventional wisdom that if you spoke out for Palestinian rights, that you were probably anti-Semitic, first of all, but second of all, that was the accusation, but also that you would get killed electorally. That like the pro-Israel lobby was so strong, and that they could just kill your candidacy. And I think we actually only needed a few examples to sort of disprove that theory. Now there's that sort of mythology has a little bit been broken. The idea that you must support Israel in order to be elected to office in the United States. And actually, I think just to end with, I thought what happened in the mayoral race here in New York City that just ended, the Democratic primary, which is the mayoral election in New York City. One of the really things that happened was, so that was going on during the assault on Gaza in May, and Andrew Yang, who was a candidate for mayor, made some very knee-jerk pro-Israel, we must stand with Israel kind of speech, which would have been typical for any Democrat even a few years ago. And he got so much pushback, and he had to walk it back. And New York City is considered, it's certainly a city that has the largest Jewish population outside of Israel. But again, a very split one, to bring us back to the beginning of our conversation. Sure. And so Jewish people were pushing back on Yang and saying, like, what are you doing? And there's also a big Palestinian population, a big Arab American population, a big Muslim population in New York City. And people were saying, like, aren't you representing those people, not just the people who support Israel? Like, this is a big, diverse city. We have lots of people who have lots of different political loyalties. Your job is not to support Israel. And like, I see that as a real sea change, that is sort of no longer the pro forma position for politicians. And I take a lot of hope from that in terms of the opportunities for long-term change.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I think that was a very helpful overview. I mean, I certainly learned a lot about the Jewish community and its relationship to Israel, Palestine, and politics, and all sorts of things. So I really appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Great to talk to you.
And for those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We're a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us as we resume our in-person services. We'll be gathering together at 5200 Fannin Street here in Houston, Texas on July 11th for our 9:30 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. services. Both services will be live streamed. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon, and hopefully in person as soon as we can get together in July. And thank you so much for watching these forum videos during the last year.